Serenity on track, constant chaos off it. Red Bull is being pulled apart at the seams by a war for control that has triggered a major warning from Max Verstappen. Wins in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia have made for the perfect start to Red Bull's season and Verstappen's bid for a fourth consecutive title, but this dominant dream team risks being destroyed from within. What started as Christian Horner's personal controversy regarding his behaviour towards a female member of staff has snowballed drastically since the allegations and a subsequent Red Bull investigation became public. Max Verstappen didn't really react to any of that, but the latest twist in a vicious struggle for power at Red Bull has now grabbed his attention. Just a couple of days after Verstappen had quite emphatically dismissed the prospect that Red Bull's dramas could lead to his early exit from the team, his tone changed dramatically. Which all leads to one simple question with a very complex answer. What the hell is going on at Red Bull? The catalyst for Red Bull's latest crisis escalation is a matter involving Helmut Marko that could yet lead to his exit despite him saying he'll continue for now. On race day in Jeddah, Marko had talks with Red Bull executive Oliver Mintzlaff, which ended with Marko declaring he will continue less than 24 hours after he indicated he might face a suspension or just walk away from the team. But Marko added the caveat that calm must be restored, and right now that is not guaranteed. So at best, this is papering over the cracks. Marko is a long-serving special advisor who wields massive influence on Red Bull Racing and was effectively the late Dietrich Mateschitz's man on the ground, having been involved in Red Bull's motorsport activities for decades. He's close to the Verstappens and historically to the Austrian side of Red Bull by dint of that Mateschitz relationship. But since company co-founder Mateschitz's death in late 2022, there has been a consistent belief that Marko has a strained relationship with the new leadership he's been forced to report to. His power has not been entirely stripped away, but there's an accountability that he never seemed subjected to before. Red Bull's F1 teams now fall under the remit of Mintzlaff, who Marko met with in Saudi Arabia amid suggestions Marko was being probed by Red Bull GmbH in relation to leaked information. Exactly what Red Bull's parent company is or was concerned by is still unclear. We know that's vague, but there's been an awful lot of speculation about this and immense leakage from Red Bull in recent weeks. Automatically, the assumption is this relates to the explosive anonymous sharing of alleged evidence from the investigation into Horner just 24 hours after Red Bull had announced the grievance had been dismissed. Marko denies this, but there are other things too, like various details emerging either side of that investigation and suggestions that Red Bull's current engine partner Honda and future partner Ford are not happy either. We know Marko talks freely, on and off the record, to various people in F1 including the media. He always has, often to Red Bull's irritation. Despite his status, Marko isn't considered by Red Bull to be an official spokesperson. If Horner or Red Bull believe Marko has acted out of line or been involved in Horner's recent scrutiny, turning the spotlight back on him could be a form of retribution. And when there's so much more going on in the background, it doesn't sound like all of this can just be swept aside by one amicable conversation in Jeddah. Marko's position at Red Bull being called into question went down extremely badly with Verstappen. In the post-qualifying press conference after scoring pole in Jeddah, Verstappen was asked about the prospect of it being Marko's final race. At that moment, Verstappen wouldn't have seen or heard Marko's initial interview with ORF, in which he had hinted he could be departing. Verstappen probably wasn't even aware that interview had happened, but his answer showed that this has been developing behind the scenes for long enough for Verstappen to already be aware something is amiss, and to not only have formed an opinion on it, but to have apparently shared his concerns with Red Bull. Verstappen strongly indicated he would consider his own future if Marko were to leave, and reiterated that multiple times in a lengthy answer and in various TV interviews afterwards. He described his loyalty to Marko as very big and said he has always made it clear Marko is an important part in my decision making. Verstappen's under contract with Red Bull until the end of 2028. That deal is bound to have exit clauses, but the main thing for Red Bull is to ensure he wants to stick around. Unsurprisingly, the three-time world champion is concerned by the prospect of losing what he calls such an important pillar of Red Bull. He said that would be not good for my situation and even went as far as declaring Helmut has to stay. Though Marko says he is for now, the significance of this Verstappen intervention is massive. It is the first time that Verstappen has indicated his place at Red Bull could be influenced by a matter involving someone else. His powerful statement of support also contrasted sharply with the qualified comments Max made about Horner in Bahrain when asked if he still had faith in his leadership. And before this all kicked off in Saudi, Verstappen had opted not to counter his father's criticism of Horner. He didn't explicitly side with Jos, but did say he isn't a liar, and certainly didn't distance himself meaningfully from the views Jos expressed. Horner insists his relationship with Verstappen is fine and that there's no tension inside the team. But Verstappen has still positioned Marko and what happens to him as a much bigger factor in Verstappen's own thought process than Horner's fate. And it may well be that Verstappen's future is intertwined with Marko's on a contractual basis, not just because of a personal loyalty, because it has been rumoured that Verstappen would be free to leave Red Bull if Marko left. In the complex power struggle plaguing both Red Bull's team and its parent company, Verstappen has avoided explicitly siding with either warring faction. But we can at least put the Verstappen camp firmly alongside Marko. The question is whether that puts them directly up against anybody else. How far are they willing to take this? Will it be as simple as if Marko goes, Max goes, and does that by extension force Red Bull to decide between Verstappen and Horner? That Marko seemingly ended up in the firing line is another twist in a contorted internal situation at Red Bull which predates Horner's scandal. The tensions with Mintslav were well known, but by the end of last year, the relationship between Marko and Horner seemed to have broken down as well. When Marko extended his Red Bull contract in early 2024, it was interpreted as a successful attempt to realign himself with Mintslav. This positioned Austria against Horner, with the Verstappens joining them too, but who knows where Marko stands now. It might be that there is no major grudge with Mintslav and that Horner versus Marko and Horner versus Mintslav are the real quarrels. Horner stated somewhat unconvincingly after the race that his relationship with Marko is no issue, though he admitted he's always outspoken, but that's Helmut. Horner has Red Bull's majority shareholding Behaviour family in his corner and wants backing as the single senior spearhead of Red Bull's motorsport activities, which would effectively sideline Mintslav and Marko and in return ensure the Thai side of Red Bull isn't frozen out by Austria exerting more control. The Behaviours and Mintslav were due to meet in Dubai the day after the Jeddah race. If Horner gets the backing he seeks, then Mintslav may just have to fall in line. And Horner's claim that both Mintslav and another Red Bull executive, Franz Vaclavic, who was also in Jeddah, have been very supportive. Which brings us back to questioning whether calm can really be restored if everyone involved in all this infighting remains in place, what happens to Marko in that case, and, as he made so painfully clear, how that impacts Verstappen too. Verstappen said after winning in Jeddah that what matters is everyone keeps the peace, and a complete reconciliation to all this can't be completely ruled out. But it seems desperately unlikely, and even if we give Red Bull the benefit of the doubt that the Saudi weekend ended with a truce of some kind, it's clear that an effort must be made to just manage hostilities, and that is a pretty weak foundation. It also doesn't change the fact that Marko walking away eventually and the Verstappens plotting a sensational move elsewhere in retaliation seems like a less far-fetched prospect now. Especially if Red Bull feels the risk of Verstappen walking away is one it's happy to take, given it would ease a significant amount of tension one way or another and free up a significant amount of money, given Verstappen's on a lucrative salary. In response to Verstappen suggesting he'd leave if Marko did, Horner even said no individual is bigger than the team, and anybody who doesn't want to be at Red Bull can't be forced to stay, including Verstappen. This could be the first step towards calling Verstappen's bluff, especially as Horner reckons 16 drivers want a Red Bull seat for 2025 already. It would be a bold gambit for Red Bull and Horner to believe they could withstand losing a driver of Verstappen's calibre, especially as there could be knock-on effects. What do senior technical figures like Adrian Newey and Pierre Vacher make of all this? If what we're hearing is correct, Newey's not particularly impressed, and certainly not firmly in Horner's corner. So should we start taking the prospect of Verstappen moving to Mercedes, or at least looking for an exit strategy of some kind, more seriously? Mercedes has been the most commonly linked as a possible shock alternative. In Saudi Arabia, George Russell said if any team had a chance to sign Max, they would 100% be taking it, while Ferrari-bound Lewis Hamilton said he is sure Max is on the list at Mercedes. Mercedes coveted Verstappen a decade ago when he was just a teenage Formula 3 prodigy, and only lost out to Red Bull because Red Bull had a Toro Rosso F1 race seat it could offer Verstappen immediately. Mercedes team boss Toto Wolff hasn't exactly ruled out making a move now, even saying in Saudi he would love to have him. Hamilton suggested it wouldn't make sense for Verstappen to leave Red Bull given he currently has the best car, and that is a sound argument. Assuming Verstappen could get out of his Red Bull contract for 2025 to replace Hamilton, why would he trade what he has now for a backward step to a team that has won just one Grand Prix since the start of these new regulations in 2022? Horner claims he can't see a reason why Verstappen would want to step out of Red Bull, and Verstappen had already admitted, well before the Marko story took hold, that as long as we perform, there's no reason to leave. But the toxic situation at Red Bull could be the kind of extraordinary circumstances that give Verstappen that reason. And it might not be for 2025, it could be for 2026 and the start of the new car and engine rules. That would let Verstappen wring every last bit of success out of his Red Bull career this year and next before the team risks collapsing on itself. It's a prospect with at least some merit, and one that Verstappen hasn't explicitly ruled out, even though he's been given plenty of chances to do that. One thing we can't allow to pass unaddressed in bringing you up to date with Red Bull's latest week of woe is the new development in the case that brought all of this to the fore. Red Bull Racing has suspended with pay the female member of staff who made the complaint against Horner. It hasn't said why, but such action implies it's either a retaliation, which is how a lot of worried observers see it, or because she has committed specific wrongdoing. The word in Saudi was that the investigation concluded she had been a dishonest witness. Red Bull will need to back that up properly if the suspension is to become a full dismissal. As we make this video, the situation was still uncertain, as the complainant's window to appeal the outcome of the investigation was still open. But as many people in F1 have noted, it means the company has already taken stricter action against her than it did Horner, who was never suspended and was allowed to continue front and centre in his very public roles while the investigation took place. Given the lack of transparency around the whole thing, this has gone down very poorly, as has a defiant stance from Horner. He's faced down a lot of questions about the lack of transparency through this process, the impact of all the scrutiny, and what's happened to the member of staff who made the allegation, and said very little. Horner has publicly positioned himself for the first time as having suffered through this very trying period, and having previously claimed it was business as normal, has now invoked his family, his wife and his children, and suggested rivals in F1 are trying to take advantage. In what has been seen as playing the victim, Horner called for the intrusion into his personal life and his family to stop, but many have pointed out that he was the one who arrived hand in hand with his wife Jerry in Bahrain and willingly had Netflix cameras following him closely in Jeddah. His most common answers have been variants of "it's time to move on," but it's not so simple. Many are struggling to just let it go and take everything he and Red Bull say on trust. And as different fires keep flaring up before the story even has half a chance of dying down, Horner's unlikely to get his wish anytime soon.